Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet. I'm your host, Bryan, and this is the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world, and we will be reviewing all of those trends that we saw in our research at Telegeography throughout 2022. So this is going to be a two-part episode because I had so many conversations and I couldn't keep them as short as I needed to because there was so much to talk about. But basically, I interviewed 6 of my colleagues across these 2 episodes on the major trends that they saw in their principal research areas across the past year. So in the first episode of this 2-part series, I'm going to talk to my colleagues Patrick Christian, Rob Schult, and Jon Hjembo. Patrick and I talked about the trends that we're seeing in both the kind of wholesale internet world, especially digging into the demand increases that we saw during COVID and how that pulled back a little bit this year, and then talk about cloud on-ramp and region changes and where their developments are focused and what that's going to mean for those who consume cloud services. Rob and I talked about pricing for transport a little bit on up into services like WAN stuff, but mostly about that transport layer. What was going on this year? Did we actually see price increases as we've been hearing so much about due to all of these inflationary factors going on around the world? Jon Hjembo and I talked about some similar stuff in the data center world and got into some really interesting things that, truthfully, I didn't know that much about. So hopefully you will learn about them too. But make sure that you check out episode 2 as well, where I talked to some other colleagues about submarine cables, about SD-WAN, about how telecom impacted global events. And of course, I'll talk to myself about the trends that we saw in the wide area network in 2022. So without further ado, let's get on to those interviews. Okay, so my guest for this segment is my colleague, Patrick Christian. Patrick was on the show pretty recently when we were talking about infrastructure development and mobile in Africa, but you're not here today really about Africa at all, Patrick. I am going to grill you on what has been going on this year, 2022, in the world of internet backbone, global internet geography, and then related to that, but a little bit different, cloud regions. So over to you, Patrick. What's going on out there?
All right. Let's see. For internet, talking backbone, we're past the 2020 COVID spike now.
Mm-hmm.
So we're getting back to the same IP bandwidth and traffic levels.
So just to pause you there, in case people aren't familiar with like what happened, we saw a big spike in traffic in 2020 due to
Right.
everyone having to move all their activities online and stuff like that. Has that subsided down to like baseline levels where it would have been growing, or did we create a kind of new floor so things are still a little bit elevated from where they might have been, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it's actually kind of back to pre-2020 growth.
Got it.
So it is, and I see what you're saying. It's back below that. We haven't seen it. It's still growing, of course, but we're not seeing at the levels that it was, during
everyone
the spike.
has stopped having things like virtual conferences and all of that, and we see that in the data, right? So,
yeah. I mean, it's still growing, of course,
mm-hmm.
and we're still seeing growth at almost 30%. So that's still very healthy growth.
And that gets us back to the age-old thing. Sorry to interrupt, but that like we constantly hear, okay, IP transit prices are always under pressure. And a lot of providers are always like, how can I keep my business going as this? But demand always stays a little bit ahead of what the pricing pressure is, right? So
Yeah. And we've seen growth kind of dropping slightly over the years, but very, very slowly. But a big part of this growth, of course, that also drives internet is the content provider growth.
Hmm.
And if we look at the internet, and one thing we've been talking a lot about lately is, or for many years now, is localization of content, localization of traffic, where you're building out more, say, cloud regions or POPs or CDN, et cetera. You're localizing content, so you don't need as much international capacity. And of course, what
Right.
we track is international part. So many were thinking that we'd start to see a decline in growth, but no, it's still growing pretty steady.
Yeah.
But we still see similar, for example, um, how the internet is set up in terms of hubs and spokes, and where we're seeing hubs
Mm-hmm.
of content has historically been out of U.S. and Western Europe and some parts of East Asia. And we see those would be the hubs for content, and then we'd see areas like Latin America, Africa, some parts of Asia that would basically be connected to Europe or the US to kind of get the content. And we thought as things started to localize a little bit more, we'd see a decrease in international traffic, but
Right.
we don't really, still growing. And in some markets, especially, for example, in Africa, where I always talk about where I work the most,
Hmm.
we actually see increase in growth because maybe there was so little content, and there's,
Hmm.
even though more content is cached locally, demand is growing because the internet works better. So we're
Right.
seeing international connectivity to Europe increasing as well. So we're
Hmm.
kind of seeing these hubs um, still very important. Like for Africa, Europe is, if we look at Africa as a whole, about 80% of the international connectivity is still to Europe, 20% is intra African. And if you look
Hmm.
at Latin America and US, it's very similar. It's about
Right.
80-20. But if you break it down in a little bit more detail, separate North Africa from South Africa, we see different something different happening, evolving. North Africa closer to Europe, so we see actually increase of connectivity for
Hmm.
content. So they're almost about 100% of the international connectivity is not to their neighbors, but to Europe. Whereas we see in sub-Saharan Africa, it's been dropping over the last 10 to 20 years from about 80% down to about 60% as they start to connect within the region. And
Gotcha. So
we
they've
see
gotten
this.
cloud regions in region and things like and some of the traffic they're trying to get to is being created in region, presumably too, right?
Correct, correct. The content we are seeing content localizing, of
Hmm.
course, and we are seeing it affecting traffic patterns a bit and capacity patterns, but it's moving very slowly.
Hmm.
Okay, so we're seeing the same thing in Latin America to U.S. Certain parts of Latin America are probably rely more on the U.S. for content, but we're seeing more connectivity to, say, for example, Brazil, because that's kind of the content hub for
Hmm.
Latin America. Same thing in Africa. You see South Africa in particular, as you see cloud data centers going in, more data centers being built, etc. We're seeing traffic patterns, instead of everything going back up to Europe, splitting off and going down to South Africa as well. So we are
Hmm.
seeing a localization, but international capacity levels are still growing. Or I'm sorry, internet growth is still, high 20s. But if
Hmm.
you compare it to private IP networks of the content providers, they've been growing, at a much faster pace over the last 10 years than internet has.
Right.
So, but we're starting to see that drop too. If also one more thing, like if you look 10 years ago, about 90% of all used international capacity was internet,
Hmm.
and now only about 30% of all used capacity is internet.
Hmm.
70% is content provider network.
Wow.
So that's another pattern we're seeing, or trend we're seeing, is a lot more is going on those private networks. But at the same time, internet still is growing at a very
Hmm.
strong rate of almost 30%.
And do you see that slowing down the content provider driven traffic, or do you think that's going to continue to grow at a fast pace as well?
Uh, Definitely seeing it slow down, but of course, it starts at a smaller volume, so you
Right.
see stronger growth at first, and you see over time, as the market matures, or as their networks mature, et cetera, we don't see as much growth. But I mean, even if you compare to 5, 6 years ago, they were growing well above 50, 60, 70% per year in growth. And
Right.
now it's
We can't
down
see
to
that anymore at these high numbers, right? So.
right. We're seeing it's getting closer to internet now, around 40%.
All right. So how does that then, you kind of tied this in already, but how does that relate more directly to what you look at as the principal investigator of our cloud and WAN infrastructure product, looking at cloud region, cloud on ramp developments? What happened there in 2022? Have we seen a lot of new growth there? Is it connecting any new regions, anything like that?
Okay. And now shifting a little bit more to the cloud and cloud regions. Of course, cloud regions have, a big effect on the internet itself, private IP, but also on the internet, because
Hmm.
where you see cloud regions go in, you see kind of an ecosystem grow, and you
Right.
see a lot more capacity, a lot more internet as well, internet growth as well. So in 2022, what we saw, um, and now this is primarily, there are other cloud providers, but the ones that I'm looking at or we're talking about are the big three: AWS, Google, Azure, and then also looking at Oracle and Alibaba. We
Hmm.
see that these companies added 17 cloud regions in 2022, which is
Wow.
actually one less than last year,
Right.
2021, and down about 10 from 2 or 3 years ago. Right as we are coming out of COVID, there was a
Hmm.
flurry of activity, but this is, it's still, if you compare to about 10 years ago, they were opening up like 10 a year or something like this. So it's
Right.
still growing pretty strongly, but it is slowing down in the number of cloud regions that we're seeing coming
Hmm.
online each year. Um, we are also seeing a focus on kind of CDN or edge pops as well, and local zones, for example, for AWS. So in Azure, which the original architecture, they didn't have availability zones for their regions, like regions divided into separate zones. It was just
Right.
a region. But now we've been seeing the past few years Azure building out availability zones within their regions. So we're
More
seeing that
like the
activity
other
too.
providers had done, right? So,
Correct,
so,
correct. So
so
kind of uncertain.
geographically, take us through that. I know that for the past few years, a lot of growth has been focused on the less developed regions because there had been to kind of band across the northern hemisphere of is that still where you're seeing growth? Or are you also seeing new instances in the already well served areas as well?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it started with more low-hanging fruit through 2010 up through the early 2010s. You saw a lot of where the internet hubs are, U.S., Western Europe, and parts of East
Hmm.
Asia, and we have seen some growth. It's been pretty slow moving out of those areas, but we are starting to see it, and actually we see a lot of growth in Middle East. And if you look at
Mm-hmm.
subcables coming online, et cetera, we see a lot of activity in the Middle East, a lot of cloud data centers being built out, um, and in 2022, there are 4 data centers launched in the Middle East.
Hmm.
Um, Now that doesn't mean in these areas, once these areas are starting to build out, they're not building anymore in kind of in North America or Western Europe. They're
Yeah,
still
that's what I was
growing.
getting at. Are we still
Yeah,
getting new
yeah.
on ramps
Oh
in
yeah,
North America and Western
definitely.
Europe, even though obviously the focus of the development is getting like the global
South.
south and less developed places
Yep.
and whatnot? Yeah.
Yep. Europe had the most regions launched in 2022. There's
Ah,
7 regions
see,
launched.
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but Asia still has the most total regions. They have 59, and Europe 45.
Hmm.
Um, but a lot of this too is Alibaba has many data centers in China, so that kind of boosts
Right.
the numbers up. So, but Asia and Europe are definitely the big regions. And we've seen so growth there in Africa. We there 3 regions, 4 regions growing. Everybody and it isn't all over Africa. It's just in
Hmm.
South Africa.
Right.
So we see three of the main ones that built cloud regions in South Africa, and then Google announced that they will be opening up a region as well.
Mm.
So, and once again, if we look at traffic patterns, once we see all these data centers starting to come in, or the cloud data centers, we see traffic patterns change a bit. In Latin America, we're seeing growth outside of Brazil, because Brazil, there's
It's
been
already done. Right.
data centers there, for since
Hmm.
2010, from the very beginning, pretty much. But now we're seeing in Chile and Colombia, and then further north, a lot of activity in Mexico too. So, and I think
So,
only Oracle is launched there. Mm-hmm.
okay, so if we had content development in Brazil, it was in the sort of years around that we saw a lot of submarine cable development. If you put on your sort of predictive analyst hat for a moment, should we expect to see some new infrastructure cable development on the west coast of South America because we have these new cloud instances?
And yes, and we already have, actually, with
Okay.
Curie, with
I have
the
not been paying as much attention to that, I'll admit.
yeah,
Yeah.
and Curie came online in 2020, and it's a Google cable, and
Mhm.
there was already a Google data center in Santiago, and then there are cloud regions. So yes, we do see, kind of at the same time. It's no coincidence that Google is building out where they're
Mhm.
building out subcables where they're building out data centers. Same thing you see in Africa. Equiano going up the west coast of Africa. And now Google has announced that they're building a cloud data center in South Africa.
Mhm.
So, and they already have some infrastructure, of course, in POPs in Nigeria and up the coast.
Excellent. All
So
right. So,
yes.
Patrick, just to close us out on internet and cloud, what do you see happening for 2023? Like, are there major announcements that we should look out for? Are there traffic patterns that you expect to sort of make any interesting changes? What are you going to be sort of on the lookout for?
Well, we're going to be looking at kind of the speed of how quickly they're rolling out these new cloud data centers, with all
Mhm.
the chaos and with the content providers at this time.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, we
and yeah,
well, no naming names, but let's just say that some content provider plans probably aren't working out as had hoped, right? So
right,
yeah.
or slowing down, because I mean,
Mhm.
just to maybe name names, but like, with Amazon, AWS revenues or profits drive Amazon, so
Mhm.
you can't
Right,
stop building out. But
right,
um, so I do think probably most of the content providers, of course, are going to be continuing to grow. There may be a slight slowdown for maybe a couple of quarters. But so we'll see how fast these new regions are opened up. But they're still announcing, and there's still 38 cloud regions that are in the planning mode that are
mm,
supposed to be launched over the next 2 years. So
right, right.
still a ton of activity. But we will see more growth and more, like I was saying, in Latin America, building out from Brazil out to the other regions. And we'll probably see in Africa within the next couple of years, 2 to 3 years, maybe it'll slow down a little bit. We'll probably see cloud regions in Nigeria and in Kenya. So we'll
Hmm.
see this building out of, out of the main hubs into the kind of growing markets. And then this will lead to, of course, maybe a shift in traffic, where we'll see a lot more growth, internet growth as well, in some of these markets that were more the emerging or developing markets. We'll see
Right,
that.
right. So 38 planned over the next couple of years, then it looks like pretty similar growth levels to what we've seen over the past couple of years, which is always a nice safe assumption, right? So,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and I, and I think it's maybe worth pointing out that you can see all of this from the end to end ecosystem level of that. If there's constantly ISPs rolling out fiber to the premises, 5G, things like that, that creates more internet demand for the services that are provided by the likes of Azure, Google, AWS, et
Right.
cetera. And so then they have to respond with more regions. They know this, and so they're probably already putting region plans in place to be able to meet that demand already, right? But wherever we're developing better internet, even in the US, where there's a broadband plan underway right now, for example.
Right. It's kind of chicken and egg, of course. It's their They know that, as in, I'll take Africa as an example because I'm always talking about
You think
Africa.
about it
But
a lot. Yeah.
yeah, you
Yeah.
see that all the local access, either to end user connectivity, a lot of fixed broadband is growing, fiber to the home, fiber to enterprise, networks growing and being built out like crazy, and new carrier neutral data centers being built like crazy as well. It's kind of the gold rush time in Africa for this. And this is all in anticipation of the hyperscalers or the content
Mhm.
providers coming, to have presence in these data centers and to serve all of this content to, new end users, new enterprises, and making business easier. And there's also the OTT, or the content provider effect, that once they move in, prices start to drop on certain,
Right.
like on capacity, at metro, but also international level.
Right. And there's always that sort of latent demand that whether it's enterprise or consumer eyeballs or whatever, when they don't have the infrastructure in place, they still want the services. So as soon as either end of the infrastructure is there, then demand will materialize and grow. Right. So,
Right. And once again, the Africa example, globally, if you look, 90% of broadband access is through mobile. Okay,
mhm.
but only, or almost like 85%. But of total capacity or throughput, mobile is only 15%.
Right.
So even though
Plans are
even
small.
though fixed
Yeah.
broadband is small number, it's 80%, 80+% of total throughput. So we're seeing also, as in Africa, has very, very small numbers for fixed broadband or fiber to the home, et cetera, in the 5 to 10% max. So once we see, and we are starting to see that, an uptick in build outs of access to, more eyeballs,
Right.
that'll, increase demand as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Cool. All right. Well, Patrick, that was really interesting. Thank you so much. I look forward to maybe we can do something more specifically about Africa again sometime too, because you love that.
Yes.
So
I will.
excellent.
That'd be great.
All right.
Okay.
Cheers and happy
Okay.
New
That's
Year.
great.
All
Thanks.
right.
And to you too. See you, man.
Bye. All right, now I'd like to welcome Rob Schult, who's the research director of our commercial team, erstwhile known as the pricing team. And so, Rob, you have been covering essentially what's like layers 1 through 3 pricing, now all the way up into overlay services, which I'm going to talk about with our colleague Brianna later, of course. But you've been covering this stuff for 20 plus years. not to put too fine a number on it, but uh and I dare say that this last year was unique among those 20 years, with the inflation factor. Is that really the case?
I would say so. I mean, I think everything equipment costs certainly have gone up, right?
Hmm.
And the knock-on effect on new cable builds, new supply, certainly has been impacted. And I think there's this huge challenge to meet market expectations on price while still making margins that you were used to, right? So
Right.
you can't have costs go up and prices continue to go down, and make any money. So
Hmm.
that's certainly been a challenge, I think, to the industry.
Right. So
Um,
it's always been the case in the past that while demand was always very high growth, right? Supply, because of the sort of telecom equivalent of Moore's law and those things, you can get more bits across the same infrastructure. So there's always been this race of supply and demand that led towards price declines. Now, just because of almost like ancillary supply factors, not really the technology, but literally silicon supplies and equipment and labor and all that, that has finally caught up with price declines. And do we really see that manifested in the data?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of different factors. That inflation of components certainly is a factor.
But probably a
You
small
know,
one, right? Like
I
I
think
would
a very
assume,
small one,
yeah.
actually.
Mhm.
When you look at card costs and the total contribution of that to the cost of a circuit over time, it's relatively small. I
Mhm.
think really the issue with the components and the availability of components has been in the aggregate availability of supply, right? So
Mhm.
the biggest impact has been with the supply chain issues is things like upgrades on new systems have been delayed, and
Right.
things like new cable deployments have been delayed.
Mhm.
So because of that, what you
Mm.
see is that the economies of scale that you achieved via upgrades were
Right.
not really realized. And
Mhm.
also, I think the fact was that capacity that was available, people were trying to grab, so they were willing to pay a price rather than trying to push the price
Mm.
lower.
Mhm.
And it wasn't available across all systems or all like submarine cables, for instance. So you really had to take what you could get in many instances
Right.
and pay what the vendor was asking for. So for the first time in my 20 years, I can say that there have been routes where prices have been stable, and actually in some cases some of the renewals are higher than they were 2 years ago,
Mhm.
just because somebody's willing to pay more, right?
Right.
So that's the first time in 20 years I can really
Yeah,
say that,
that's really
which is
interesting. So to summarize what you're saying, essentially, first, it's not so much the cost of the actual components has been the driving factor, but the fact that the delays in getting the components have curtailed expected supply increases. And then secondly, because there was this run up in demand in 2020 for capacity, I talked about this with our colleague Patrick, that people bought all kinds of capacity at any price they could get their hands on, and that effectively drove the price in different directions than normal. Is that fair?
yeah. And I think what's really interesting is like the pipeline is very strong,
Hmm.
and that when a upgrade is required, it gets scheduled and it takes a certain amount of time because the vendor supporting the upgrade has to deliver cards, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
That capacity, once it's I guess tagged for deployment, in many cases that's sold before it's actually activated. And we
Right.
see that on Europe to Africa, we see that on Europe to Asia, Trans-Pacific. Pre-selling of upgrade capacity before it even exists is a real thing. Probably to the detriment of some of the salespeople. They're happy to get it now, but then they run out of stuff to sell.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, all those routes we've definitely seen a real impact on the availability of supply.
And so most of what you've been talking about here would be your currency of the realm, 100G waves transport. First, what does that landscape look like, and then secondly, how does that sort of trickle up into different services, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think for backbone networks, the thing that we've seen is 100 gig has become the currency of the day.
Hmm.
We very rarely see people buying 10 gig on long haul networks anymore, just because, again, you're paying 4 to 5 times more for a 100 gig than you are a 10 gig. In most instances, that's kind of the multiple that we've seen, down
Hmm.
from sort of six a
6 or
couple of
7.
years ago,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So that price compression makes it more viable to build your network at scale and give you the opportunity to sort of future proof it for a short amount of time
Decent
as you
time,
grow
right?
into that 100 gig.
And demand is strong enough that that's really easy to do
Totally.
to fill up,
And
right?
I think that is the one thing you want to walk away with from here is that demand is still strong. I mean,
Hmm.
it's maybe a little slower than it was, but we're still talking 30 to 40% in lots of
Right.
different areas. I mean, 30% is kind of a minimum for any continental global growth for international bandwidth. And 30% on some of these base numbers is like a new cable system, right?
Hmm.
So the requirements are still growing pretty dramatically. And I don't think that, I think that the view is that will continue. So
Right. And so if we say 100G is the currency of the realm, as it were, that's probably long been the case on like sort of transatlantic or something like that. Is that true elsewhere in the world as well now?
It is, and almost surprisingly so.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly expected on Europe to Asia, intra-Asia, trans-Pacific. That's kind of been the most important circuit sale.
Right.
U.S. to Australia certainly has changed over the last couple of years to 100 gig, but we even see demand for 100 gig in Central America and the
Wow.
Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
And and the carriers we talk to there saying it just makes sense because it's available, right? It just makes sense to jump to that next higher
Right.
capacity.
So then in a
Economically.
certain sense, that might take up some of the lack of price declines that we're seeing, as if you shifted from the higher cost per bit for 10G waves to the lower cost per bit for 100G waves. Even if the absolute price, like in your parlance, the MRC, right, the monthly recurring charge for that 100G wave is the same as it was in, say, 2019, at a per bit level, customers are still paying less if they've moved from, say, 10G waves to a couple of 100G waves.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you did the math, you could see that. But I think
Mm-hmm.
there certainly is a network migration. But I think just in general, when we see people finalizing sort of their network configurations, it's all 100 gigs, and those 100 gigs support all the underlying services that they offer. I think you mentioned IP transit. I mean, achieving a lower cost per bit is the goal, right? Because IP transit marketplace is high volume, low margin. That's the only way you're going to be able to compete. And I think shifting to 100 gig at some point in time, 400 gig, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although we've not really seen a huge number of sales in that at that level. I think that's sort of where it's going ultimately. And I think, one of the things you talked about, price erosion today, if you look on a per annum basis, this last year, price erosion has slowed, almost globally, right? So like transatlantic prices, we've seen sort of flattish, maybe 10 to 15% year on year. Trans-Pacific, that's probably the one to look at, which has been exceptional. Price erosion there has been less than 10%,
Wow.
but you can attribute that a little bit to the availability of supply. There's a lot of geopolitics with new cable systems crossing the Pacific and the ability to land, the ability to complete. So there's been a lot of pent up demand on that route, and it's had to go through sort of existing cables. And the owners on those cables are like, well, you have to come through me. I'm going to keep the prices where they are. Intra-Asia prices, we've seen, sort of less than 15%. And then, a universe where 20 to 25% is expected, that's kind of been exceptional. And even one of the places where we saw supply really impact price erosion was U.S. to Latin America. I think the say Miami Sao Paulo route for 100 gigs fell. The last couple of years, it was 25 to 30% per year.
Right, new cables were on that route.
Yeah, and this last year, it's been a little bit less. I think that's less of a supply-demand issue than it is, people have what they need, kind of. There's kind of a balancing out there, but that's been an impact. Now, I think, Greg, the one thing I really wanted to point it out, though, is while I can say for the first time in 20 years that, prices have been more stable, and in some cases, you could find instances where maybe prices went up for renewals. It's really in the long term dependent on supply, right? So we see a huge number of new cable systems that have been commissioned that will come into service. And when those cables come into service, it'll create that imbalance again. There'll be a huge or a significant number of new vendors, or not new vendors, but vendors with supply to sell, and there'll be a lot more competition. And I think that is something that we want to point out, that we're in a holiday period, maybe the next couple of years while this works itself through, and we are not yet at the RFS states for some of these new cables. I think it's a good point for pricing and for salespeople. Going forward, you're going to see a huge amount of supply pretty much in every region that's going to have a knock-on effect. So we think it's
enjoy those cushy margins while you can.
Yeah.
And expect the declines to resume.
Yeah, at some point in time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in some places it'll be more dramatic than others, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think one market that we really expect prices to fall pretty significantly is in Africa. There's a that's a market where we see some of the greatest growth rate for international demand. So there's a lot of new requirements, but like currently there's a system called Equiano that's coming online. And the number of fiber pairs are it's more fiber pairs than were there before. And then there's 2 Africa, which is going to offer capacity into lots of new marketplaces. So sort of that step increase of supply will dramatically change it. And I want to say the price erosion that we've seen of 20% certainly will resume in those routes, and we kind of think that it could be more than that. So yeah, that would be one I would point out.
So we're always going to look back at 2022 and see a little bit of a flat spot on the curve, but then it'll otherwise look like it has for the last 20 plus years.
We think so, yeah. And we've spent a bunch of time sort of reviewing our forecast models, right? Sort of, marking to market what's actually happened, and trying to anticipate, when do those new cables come online? When is that new supply going to be available and going to impact price? So, I think that's something that we hope to keep a better track of. The RFS dates still are kind of shifting because there's so many new systems out there. And I'm sure Alan will talk about this in better detail than I can. But because the RFS date shifts further out, because there are only so many submarine cable ships, right? There's only so many you can deploy at the same time. There's a competition for available resources. Maybe it's 3 years time, but it will happen, and we think that price erosion will recommence. On the terrestrial side, which is kind of interesting, it's already really inexpensive, I guess is the point, right? Like, 100 gig waves in Europe are super, super cheap. And, you kind of see on the terrestrial side that becoming kind of standard worldwide.
And is that mostly a supply issue? So when you lay a submarine cable, there are limitations of how many fiber pairs you can include in your little garden hose sized tube or whatever you want to call it. Whereas terrestrially, you could just dump fiber in ducts as much as you want, essentially.
Yeah, I think the incremental cost to light a new wavelength is really inexpensive. There's not even like a truck move anymore. A lot of the vendors will ship, SLT gear pre-configured. So it's a software activation, right? So you just turn on 100 gigs like that, within a few hours. So I think, we definitely see super competition there. Terrestrial markets is places that you'll start to see a greater movement towards 400 gig, I think.
Right.
And
because the upgrades are easier to accomplish, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, that was a great review. Thank you very much. And now it's my task, I think, to relate that to what everybody else is going to tell me.
Yeah. It does have a knock on, right? Like, I know you're going to review some of the enterprise pricing. The transport pricing at layer 1 is sort of like the core of all that.
Foundation.
Right. So if you can move packets and frames and stuff like that at a lower cost, that will inevitably impact the cost of everything else. So.
Right. So that's like the primary resource, and the manufacturing that happens to that primary resource is what we do further up the stack, essentially.
Yep, absolutely.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Rob. This was good fun, and I hope to have you on the show for a real thing next year. So
I hope to join you. Thanks.
All right, for this segment, I have Jon Hjembo, who's the senior manager of our data center research. Jon is our expert on metrics about data center geography, capacity, connectivity, and pricing. And I'm going to grill you, Jon, about what is going on in data centers in 2022. So what have been the major themes this year?
There's always so much going on in this industry. It's really hard to keep up with everything at the same time. But for me, this year has been absolutely extraordinary. I'm sure for many people, it's been just beyond extraordinary because of what we're seeing with regulation in some of the biggest markets in the world right now, what we're seeing going on related to the energy crisis in Europe due to the war with Ukraine. So those two things are just by far the biggest trends that I'm trying.
So what do you mean by regulations? You mean regulations of data, like GDPR kind of stuff, or what?
No, this has to do more with regulations involving data centers. So a couple of years ago, this really started with Singapore and the Netherlands, where both of those areas, the government started evaluating the impact of data centers on land use and energy use. So we had some initial kind of halting of new development as they were sort of evaluating things. And then both of these jurisdictions came back to the table with more stringent regulations this year. But then there was also a confluence of some things happening in other key markets as well. We started to see regulators taking a closer look in Ireland, in Germany, and that has really kind of accelerated over the course of this year. And so as a result, we're seeing a lot of soul searching as to what the industry looks like going forward. So, I mean, and these are good changes. These are probably very necessary. I'm sure they're very necessary changes as long as they're done right. But what it means is that there are going to be some significant growing pains in the short term.
Right. And if you design things to specifications to meet regulations in one market, that tends to bleed over even into markets that may not have those regulations yet, but likely will, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess one of the problems in the early term is that as you have very core markets trying to make these changes and try to move in the right direction, on some level, it's going to drive business elsewhere to places that are less regulated, which in the short term means that there's kind of a lag in these necessary reforms for looking at long-term sustainability, but in the long term, the changes do come around. And certainly,
I didn't know there was a race to the bottom in the data center industry. That's really interesting.
Not necessarily, but there's certainly some scrambling, and really, I think what it's a testimony to the urgency of market competitiveness over and against reforms that need to be made because they're costly. You don't want to be the one making changes when all of your competitors can do things more cheaply somewhere else. So it's going to, in the short term, it drives some of that business elsewhere. But in the long term, because of the data gravity in these really key markets, operators will be forced to make the changes, but on the same playing field, thus, which will help with the competitiveness.
Right. So it won't benefit any particular competitor, but it does make the competitiveness between metro markets different, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. So just briefly, the situations in the biggest markets are really Singapore, Germany, and the Netherlands. So, some of the absolute biggest hubs in the world. In Singapore, they've got this pilot plan going now where they're allowing a very limited amount of new data center development while they're trying to figure out how on earth to move forward long-term with a very limited amount of space, very limited amount of power in an industry that uses a tremendous amount of both. As a result of that, we're seeing direct spillover into other markets. Right now, we're seeing a lot of development pushing into Malaysia, right over the border into Johor Bahru, which is virtually connected to Singapore with gobs and gobs of fiber over bridges.
Right. But there's still a different, from my experience anyway, different pricing structure for IP transit, for example, and transport than there would be to Singapore. So that might be an interesting dynamic that people have to work through, right? So
I'm sure it will be. And that's certainly going to be a major challenge in the short term. But I think as some of these changes are forced and as you see more competitors moving into these locations with fewer barriers to entry, some of those price differences will decrease. So
have we seen any shakeup as a result of this in terms of what the biggest markets are and how quickly they're growing. So I know one of the things you look at is, for example, how much square footage there's available, how much of it is leased. Has that dynamic changed because these changes have only happened in certain markets? So for example, I take it that these regulations haven't hit the U.S. yet as much. Is that good for Northern Virginia, for example, or other growing data center markets in North America?
So no, it could be in some ways, but the problem is that these are locations that are absolutely critical, both from a geographic perspective and from the data gravity perspective.
Right. So you can't replace Singapore with something that's halfway across the world, of course.
Not easily.
But yeah.
And you see some attempts to do that on some level. It's definitely driving some distribution of data across a wider number of locations, especially when you look at Singapore and the development scrambling across Southeast Asia right now. But there's talk about that in Europe too. But the dependence on these core markets is so strong that it continues to gravitate there. I mean, it's interesting when you look at the German situation. Then, so another example. So a lot of the regulation there has been specific to the Frankfurt city jurisdiction itself. And so a lot of development has just gone to the surrounding suburbs and exurbs. But at the same time,
really interesting.
Yeah.
And just for the audience sake, Frankfurt is one of, if not the largest data center markets in Europe. Is that
yes.
correct?
So, it's absolutely one of the very largest in Europe, right there with London and Amsterdam. So, so if you look at the development that's in the pipeline right now, about 70% of it is in the wider metropolitan market. Right. The only ones who are really developing right in the city are Digital Realty and Equinix right now, with the exception. And this is where it's going to be interesting moving forward. They're trying to figure out how to push sustainability measures, and this is true not just in Germany but elsewhere too. And by the way, the issue in Frankfurt has now gone to the federal level, which is now creating an Energy Efficiency Act, which could affect development across the entire country. Right. So the big question that regulators are wrestling with is what do the data center operators bring to the table? What can they do for us to help us achieve greater sustainability in the long term, other than just taking massive amounts of resources? What can they do to feed back? So they're actively working to craft sustainability measures, including sharing waste heat, which has been talked about for a really long time, but is really difficult to achieve and hasn't, we don't see many successful examples of that yet.
Sure.
But we're starting to see partnerships being built up. A lot of these data center companies are owned by investment groups that also own energy enterprises or other types of or construction companies, and can work together to kind of figure out different facets of how to solve some of these problems. So there are companies in Germany now who are coming up with case studies to build within these regulations, using partnerships that they already have to install solar panels on their roofs for less money than they would be charged, if they were working through somebody else entirely, or working with partners who can help them solve issues involving sharing waste heat and so forth for heating and other types of buildings in the immediate areas. So there's a lot going on. But we're very much in this unstable period in between what's been and what's going to be in the future, and in a lot of, I think we're seeing a fundamental shift in how data center development is going to be going forward in some of these places.
Yeah, which kind of brings me back to a point I made earlier, in the sense that sometimes this does not always work. Definitely, because I, as your resident sort of law and economics dabbler, I can tell you that there are some cases where it doesn't work, but some cases regulations do spawn innovations that the market hadn't had the push to enact yet.
Yeah.
So if these regulations spawn innovations that are actually efficient, that actually work, that could spread again to markets that don't have the regulations even in place, right? So.
Yeah, that's true. And yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of this, we talk about innovativeness in the data center industry quite a bit because a lot of it is driven by economics, trying to do things more efficiently, doing things better. But there are some times where the innovations end up putting you at a competitive disadvantage in the short term, and then kind of getting that playing field leveled via regulation can help spur that even further. Right. And then, on a secondary level, as operators in other places are seeing this happening and embracing for it to happen in their own jurisdictions, it could spur private sector movement in that direction as well, in order to kind of avoid the situations that you're seeing in Germany, Netherlands, and elsewhere, where the government might come in and try to level the playing field, but to varying levels of efficiency or with goals that are varying levels of realistic.
Right.
So,
exactly.
And that's really the big arguments right now. How realistic are these goals, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. So I want to touch before we run out of time here on something that you mentioned in passing at the start, which was energy crisis in Europe. In the U.S. now, I know our crude oil barrel prices are down to somewhat close to pre-Ukraine war levels, but that's probably not going to happen in Europe in the near term. So what's the impact there that you've seen?
Yeah, it's so I've been really nervous about what we're reporting on data center market pricing, and I've spent a lot of time this cycle, and we're working on finalizing our data for this cycle, chasing down our survey respondents and making sure I have a really good picture of what's going on.
Have prices gone up?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes.
Yeah.
It's much more so in Europe than in the US, let's put it that way. But here's where it's connected. When you look at energy prices in Europe, and of course they're directly tied to the underlying source of energy generation. Right. Natural gas accounts for 35% of energy generation in Europe. It's completely intertwined with those utility rates that they're paying. So the fact that they're completely transitioning away from dependence on Russian gas to finding other sources, yeah, they're doing that, but it's still going to take a long time to build up the infrastructure needed to sustain that that decoupling from dependence on Russian gas. So there is going to be this period where those prices are going to fly upward, and this winter is going to be really hard. And so when it comes to the underlying data center pricing, though, colocation pricing, there really isn't a direct correlation. It is absolutely affected by those energy rates, those underlying energy rates. It's one of the very biggest things, but it's not a perfect correlation. And, as analysts, we like
factors, real estate development.
And as an analyst, I would love to come up with a neat story about how this all works, but it's honestly, it's kind of complicated.
Well, even messier would be does that impact cloud services pricing that has to live on all of these servers and all of that? My guess is that those are elastic enough that it won't in a way that we immediately see.
No,
but
that's right. Not immediately, but at some point it'll unravel and trickle down to that level too, in a very distributed fashion. That'll be hard to draw a line to. Right. But what I'm consistently hearing is that, especially starting January here, we're going to see price increases in Europe for colocation of 20 to 40%.
Wow, that's a big
jump. In some cases, that's already started, and then it's going to escalate from there. Perhaps in some cases on a monthly basis, which is pretty alarming. It's going to be a very rough time. The other thing, though, is that on some level, those price increases will be buffered or hidden within other fees to some level. So we're going to see some changes in cross-connect pricing too, which really has no bearing on underlying costs, but it's going to absorb some of that. And we're going to see more of that in the US, where there are still other kind of localized competitive factors driving the market a lot more than the underlying energy rates. So
Right.
we'll see price increases here too, but it won't be nearly as dramatic, at least not yet.
Mm-hmm. All right. So you heard it from Jon Hjembo. Prepare your data center budgets for some changes in the coming years. And it remains to be seen what kind of knock-on effects that has for the rest of the telecom cloud network as a service, whole infrastructure ecosystem. But I suspect there could be something worth watching there over the coming few years. All right, Jon, thanks so much. That was really interesting. And I'll just put in a little plug that, of course, sustainability is good, and we should want that for the industry, but we have to balance it out with all of these difficult factors, right?
So. Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, my pleasure, Greg. Good talking with you.
Okay, so I hope you all learned something in those interviews. Even though I talk to my colleagues about this stuff often, I still was able to pick out a few things that I hadn't been following, and that's why I really like these conversations, because there's just so much going on in so many different spaces, and yet it all works together into this really interconnected ecosystem. And I know those are kind of buzzy words, but it's because, they are the words that really describe how all of this fits together, that you can't understand one type of network without understanding the transport layers that go underneath the data centers that all of the servers and interconnects are sitting in, and all of these kinds of trends. And so I think it's great to get this review across different areas that we look at and put it all together. So make sure that you tune in next week, where we're going to bring in, like I mentioned in the intro, submarine cables. So we'll be talking about kind of the whole spectrum, from the bottom layer, if you will, the submarine cables that transmit data between continents, up to that kind of more top level in terms of layers 1, 2, 3 that we look at. I'll be talking about the WAN, and my colleague Bryan will be talking about SD-WAN as an over-the-top kind of service. Then we'll put all of that together in a really new way for this podcast, certainly in a sense, and looking with Tim Strong about when telecom impacts kind of more global events and hits the non-telecom news, to kind of capstone all of that off. So be sure you tune in and listen to that. Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.